Hello and welcome to the Digital Digest, your weekly breakfast of insights, tips and tricks, and general information that will help anyone trying to move things forward in this digital world of accounting. If I can get my teeth in. This show is brought to you by Digital Disruptors, and we're trying to push the boundaries in this digital accounting space. So hopefully what we're going to discuss today is going to be helpful. This episode is all about Beacon CRM, part of our not-for-profit series, and we're deep diving into a specific app and talking a bit about where it fits and where you maybe want to consider it. And we've got the wonderful John Toon to help us discuss this today. So look, I'm going to hand over to you, John. What is Beacon?
Morning, Ryan. I'm not sure I feel particularly wonderful at the moment, but we'll get through this. I'll get over my man flu and we'll be all good. So Beacon CRM is something I came across probably last year, I think it was, and British startup, and they've been around for around about 7 years now, and focus purely on building CRM for charities and not for profits particularly. And one of the things that really appealed to me when I sort of first came across it was that, number one, it is charity specific, and there aren't really that many competitors in that market. And I know we'll touch on those shortly. But also, having now got a bit more involved in them and stuff, they've got a really proactive Slack group and a whole bunch of channels where they're talking to either people like ourselves who are implementing CRM or even some of their customers to get sort of direct feedback. And they're incredibly agile in terms of listening to feedback and then either providing an update in the software or actually just correcting us where maybe we've made an assumption that it can't do something, and then they go, no, it can do this, and you just need to go in here and do that. I think you mentioned just before we came on, they've won, I think, is it the fundraising magazine sort of CRM of the year for 5 years on the trot, I think it was. And so they're absolutely supported and backed by people working in this sector, and I think that's a great result to get, if you like, endorsement from the sector, because I think with the lack of real sort of really good competition, I think, in this market, it means that there's plenty of opportunities for charities to really improve how they run their organizations. And the good quality CRM is really important. And I guess we can get onto the details of why that is in a minute.
Definitely. And look, you mentioned there are others, and I think, our plan is to focus on Beacon. But before we do that, let's touch on some of the others in this space, because in any situation, you can't just focus on one system. You should always benchmark. You should always consider the alternatives. And the first one I came across, which must have been good 4 or 5 years ago at least, was Infoodle, which had the weirdest name for an app, but pitched itself as that CRM for charities, focused on kind of gift aid, reclaims, and as its big differentiator back then, its integration into Xero. I've not really seen much of that system anymore, John. Do you come across it much?
No, I've not seen much of it either. I don't really come across it. Certainly not from a perspective of bumping into organisations that have got it installed. I did used to use it a few years ago, and it was for that benefit of being able to do gift aid claims, because they had a very slick process of being able to capture all of the necessary information that was required to make that process a bit slicker, and that integration with Xero was helpful. But it's not something, like I say, that I see that often at the moment, certainly in the market, and it's not something that we tend to recommend anymore, because I find it is relatively simple as a system. So it's good for very, very small charities, I would say. But I think if you're mildly complicated or need some other support around stuff like, for example, managing fundraising, or managing donors and stuff, then I think you probably start to switch to other competitors.
Completely agree. Yeah, I always looked at it as that kind of entry level system, right? The price point fits, but if you want something that's going to scale with you, but you don't want to go into a full ERP, you want to still build it round maybe a Xero ecosystem, then kind of Beacon's a good fit. There is another one in the space though that we're aware of, which is Donify, and you told me something just before we started this, which I hadn't heard, John. So what's happened to Donify?
So breaking news, Ryan, that Donify got acquired by Access, I think literally about 3 days ago. So, now part of the Access suite of products. I don't think there's any data disclosed around sort of how that acquisition's come about in terms of value, etc. An interesting one, because Access did have a CRM for charities, and acquiring Donify maybe is an indication that they're in-house built one was maybe not quite as good as they wanted it to be, possibly.
Was this one of those traditional ones? Because I know obviously they've had their old suite and they're moving now everything into a fully integrated cloud. They're acquiring different platforms and then essentially connecting them in so they can share data into the kind of Access Financials platform. Is the old one you refer to the more traditional build?
It is. It's I think it was on-prem. I might be wrong, but I think it was on-prem, whereas Donify is very much cloud-based. And Donify, to be fair, very nice, very slick system. Certainly a step up from Infoodle, and had some really interesting features and functionality, and a pretty solid price point as well to go with that.
Yeah, look, I don't know how Access have any more money left. They seem to be buying a new app every week. But good on them. They're building one hell of a combination of different products and all good products in the space. So they're going to have what we'd call as a modern ERP, but all Access owned. But let's dive a little bit into Beacon. I'm going to first touch on the fact that, like we referenced it a couple of times, is integration into Xero. And when I did my research on this product, something I loved is that they use both their own system and Xero in their own finances. So they're constantly iterating the system because of their own needs, and the integration between the platform you can pretty much trust because they're using it on a day-to-day for their own business. Where if you pick up some of these systems and they say it integrates into Xero or QuickBooks or Sage, you're like, yeah, but how well does it integrate? So they're kind of proving the concept itself by having that in place and what using it internally.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think actually what's quite clever about the integration as well is that it's not a one-way integration, which is really important, I think, because this is a platform where you can, for example, take donations or distribute grants and manage that through the platform, and that means that you're going to have data flows going both ways, and they're not always necessarily going to be triggered out of Xero, and not out of sort of things like the bank reconciliation process or something else. And I think that's really important because I think quite often charities do struggle when they'll have multiple multiple income streams potentially. Some of it will be donation related, some of it may be grant related, some of it may be trading related, and then possibly other things like memberships and admission entry tickets to various things as well. So charities can be quite complex in terms of the number of income streams that they have, and they tend to have to be managed through lots of different platforms or in lots of different ways. And so you generally can't manage all of those in a finance system because you tend to struggle to be able to connect all the pieces of the jigsaw together to make that work. And so that's a nice thing about Beacon, is like it allows you to do some of those things like ticket sales, for example, or other things, collect all that information, then push it back into Xero so that it all works. Whereas some other systems would be relying on Xero pushing that out to the CRM to help you aggregate that data, which it makes the processing a bit more manual often.
Yeah, definitely. And having audited many not-for-profits in my day, I know that the income side is the most challenging of pretty much any organization type I've come across. And tracing paperwork and verifying, but also just the amount of time that's sunk into it by the internal team. Having a system that can automate a lot of that is a huge win. And because audits for charities start at a lower level generally, you've got this paperwork requirement, the traceability at a much smaller entity size. So having a system that can do both, make it more efficient as you scale, and also cover the kind of audit requirements is a big plus for the not-for-profits. And yeah, I think it's something that realistically, Beacon is not just a CRM from how we'd call like a CRM, right? It's an operational system for a charity. It's built beyond a CRM. They call themselves or have been voted the number one CRM, but I think it's a key operational system that handles the income side. And look, talk us through some of the income streams that Beacon is built to help automate.
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, it'll connect into sort of all of the traditional sort of fundraising things. So if you've got if you want to collect money direct on your website, for example, it allows you to create forms and create links that you can plug into your website, so you can start to take money direct. And then in the back end of that, it also links into a multitude of payment processing systems, so like go cardless, like Stripe and other things. So it has all of the kind of key things that you kind of expect there. They then also have the ability to manage legacies, so you can have a form that sits on your website, so you can be notified of legacies, and you can capture that information and then connect it up so that you know maybe which legal practice or something might be dealing with the estate in the future, as well as general sort of grants and other fundraising. And then also the other thing that you quite often see in the charitable sector is wanting to be able to connect into some of these fundraising platforms like Just Giving, for example, like Virgin Money and other things like that. Again, all of those things don't play particularly nicely with the finance system. And when we were talking about why it's important to be able to aggregate this and collect it someplace, it's to be able to collect this in a central place so that you can then go, right, okay, that was £30 from Ryan that I've received through Just Giving, and I can then match that when I go into my finance system, or I can track that as well in the CRM. And that ability to be able to track fundraising is really important, right? Because a lot of charities rely on regular donations, but then also rely on their donors for campaigns. So, if you're I don't know, a museum and you want to build out a new collection, or you want to try and acquire something that's of a particular sort of public interest, you want to be able to sort of go back to particular donors and say, oh, do you know what, they're really interested in this type of art, for example, and then I can go and target them and say, look, it'd be great if you could give us £50 or £100 or something towards trying to collect it. So those kind of things are there. Then, as I mentioned before, they have the ability to create membership forms and have quite a complex set of rules and things around that, so that you can have memberships to particular types of charities. And again, that's very prevalent across the sector. Again, when you think about things like museums or other sort of more sort of public type attractions that tend to be charitable, they do tend to have some form of membership attached to them. And again, some of that will be gift aid related or not, so you've got that additional level of complexity. Then they also have the ability to do events and ticketing and things like that. So again, lots of attractions will have ticketed events or have things that will come into them, and so you've got this kind of wraparound of all of the major sort of income streams that you could potentially have coming into a charity, and ways of managing and dealing with those in a fairly efficient, nice, slick, intuitive way. And I think that's the most important thing from a user perspective. What I really like about Beacon is like a lot of it is very intuitive. It can be incredibly complex in the back end, and sometimes you do need to spend a bit of time figuring that out. But on the face of it, you can set up a lot of these things within a matter of minutes and have them up and running without having to get into reading setup guides and all these kind of things to make it work.
Yeah, and I guess the other area which I think you touched on, but not in too much detail, that can be very large from an income stream perspective, but varies depending on the type of charity you are, is grant making. So are you awarding grants? Are you receiving grants? How's that working? But also how are you tracking that? How are you making sure you've allocated to the right, the cost essentially to the right income? And all of that is possible within Beacon, which is great. But as well as the income side, you do have the challenges. A big challenge of the charity side, which is pretty unique, is the fact you've got lots of volunteers. This is not something you experience in most other industries. And Beacon is set up to work for the volunteering side as well. So tracking the availability of volunteers. So then, they can put in, I guess, I'm free at this time, free at that time. And so you know when you can call on them, but also what skills they've got, what interests they've got. And so you know that you could get a huge pool of potential volunteers and pull on them when you're working on a certain project. And that's really hard to track manually. It's virtually impossible. It's based on the skill set of the team you've got and their ability to retain knowledge rather than a digital system. And the value and automation of the charity, not-for-profit business is dictated by actually how much you can automate, how much data you've collected. So I think the fact it handles volunteering is what I mean. It goes beyond CRM, right? It's going into just management of the entire organization.
Well, volunteer management is probably one of those things where you see the most in charities, where it is done on a big spreadsheet somewhere, or someone's kind of got it in their their little black book, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's like, oh yeah, we need a football coach on Saturday, right? Well, I know Dave, he can turn up and do a couple of hours coaching on a Saturday morning, and that's kind of how it works. And I guess particularly particularly if you do have an organization that maybe works with young children, right? You've got a whole set of extra or extra requirements in terms of making sure that you have DBS checks for people that are working with young people, or even vulnerable people, similar kind of rules as well. And being able to track and maintain that and make sure that those checks haven't expired, or that that new people coming in have got the appropriate things in place. Being able to track that does end up being sort of very complex. And like I say, I've seen it in very big, messy spreadsheets, which aren't particularly well managed. And I guess from a finance point of view, that's maybe something that us as accountants don't often think about, because it's not something that you would audit necessarily. It's not something that you'd maybe have much visibility of. But it's a huge area for charities. It's how a lot of them function, and it's also very important for them to make sure that from a compliance point of view, because they are sort of, although they're volunteers, they are sort of quasi employees, because they do have a responsibility for them, that they make sure that they're keeping track of all of these people.
Yeah, and it's something that people management you kind of expect from a HR system, but HR systems aren't really tailored to work effectively with volunteers. So you need that specific dedicated software, and the fact that this is inside Beacon, just it makes sense, right? If you're growing, but that comes back to what you were saying, John. It's not a simple system. They've got a lot of things you can do in it. It may take a little bit longer to get used to. And so you need to make sure that you are either of a scale or growing into that scale. Otherwise, it may be a bit overwhelming for the organization you are. So where do you think it starts to kick in? What size organization would you say Beacon's a good fit from, starting from, and maybe up to, like from your experience?
Well, I could do one better than that, Ryan, because Fundraising Magazine, who gave them this award for being the best CRM in the charity sector for the last sort of few years, they also release some research that goes into the CRM sector every year. And so this is from back in May, so it's a few months old, about 6 months old. But their research shows that the size of charities that are most typically using Beacon are in the sort of below million turnover threshold, and then between sort of 1 million and 10 million. Once they get above 10 million, there's not that many using it, and they tend to be in some of the more what I would call sort of traditional but long-term products that have been around, like Blackboard and Razor's Edge, which I'm not a big fan of, to be fair. They're very clunky systems. But that's where it is, and like I say, I've seen I have seen very small charities use this, and I've seen slightly larger charities use this. I think the last one that we had that used it had an income of around about 3 or 4 million, I think it was, which is a mixture of trading income and donated income as well. But yeah, I mean, what I really like about Beacon and why I think it works quite well for a range of size of organizations is that out of the box, as I kind of said, as alluded to, it's quite straightforward and simple. So it makes it quite easy to implement, and it means it covers, pretty much all of the, ticks all the boxes that a small organization would have. Then as you get to a slightly larger organization where maybe you want some elements of customization, or you want to maybe add, you want to be able to collect maybe some different types of information, or add fields and customize the product a little bit, you can also do that, but in a fairly structured way without making it really complex. And what's even more interesting about that is you can report on all of that customization as well. So you don't end up with this kind of weird thing, which you and I have experienced with our PMS systems, right? Is you put custom fields in and then you can't necessarily always report on them. And that's a real that's a real challenge, because there's no point in having customization if you can't then use that data for something in the future.
Yeah, and it's standard that maybe it's in there, but the reporting engine's just not built to work with it, and then you have to start looking at exporting it or connecting in via an API to do your reporting. You're adding costs and complexity there. So having it all in one place is where your employees, your potential volunteers are going to be interacting is critical, really, especially on the key operational metrics. But something that I did want to flag here is we've talked about what it can do. We've talked a lot about Xero, but I think it's worth talking about the flexibility of it, the integrations. You talked about payment side. Something to make it very clear here is that it only integrates with Xero. It has exports into other finance systems, so it can work with QuickBooks Online, it can work with Sage, it can even work with larger systems such as Xledger, but they're all CX3 export. So it doesn't have what we would call a proper integration.
Yeah.
And that kind of comes back once again to why I guess, John, you and I like working with Xero, because it creates more opportunity when you're looking at some of the best systems in the market. If you go and find your best operational system, it's more likely than not they will connect into Xero before others. And if you're talking about that, say 1 million to 10 million space, Xero works very well in that, especially if you can condense down all of those payments into a daily summary, right, and push that through, so you're not hitting the transaction limits. But I think it's very clear, you need to make it very clear if you're on a different finance system and you're considering Beacon, we would probably recommend you switch to Xero unless there's some reason you can't, because you get some significant operational benefits, some automation by doing so. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, no, I'd completely agree. I think the only thing I'd just add to that is that Beacon does have a Zapier integration, so there's other flexibility around potentially automating certain things into other systems potentially. But again, that does require them to have a Zapier integration and connections at their end as well. But no, I'd completely agree. I mean, we know that generally the UK market, particularly at the when it's looking at the Xero space, is that people build for Xero first. Typically, then it's QuickBooks, and then it's Sage after that. That's just down to the nature of what's most popular in the market, what's easiest to build into, what's most accessible, etc. And so it makes absolute sense. And that's one of the reasons, like you say, Ryan, that you and I tend to lean more towards Xero as a platform of choice, because it tends to give you better opportunities to integrate best of breed solutions in the wider ecosystem.
Definitely. But the finance side is just a small part of the integrations that Beacon can do. It can integrate into websites depending on what you're on. It can integrate into payment engines, which I know you've talked about, being direct debit or card payments. Essentially, whatever way your customer wants to, or your donor wants to pay, it should allow that choice. But it's a CRM. So if it's a CRM, it needs to be integrated into email marketing, essentially. And it does that with a good integration into MailChimp, which is ironic given that's an Intuit product and it doesn't integrate into QuickBooks Online, but integrates into MailChimp, into Digital. And you can also interact with your Outlook and Gmail. Not a full-blown integration, but you can interact, so you're collecting communications you need. My understanding is it does some bits in the fundraising space as well. As you said, you talked about Gift Aid, Just Giving, but there's some others that I've not worked with not-for-profits such as Facebook Donate, Fundraise Up. So these may be ones that are used a lot, but not something that I've worked with.
And I think quite often these kind of platforms are a little bit like what we see in e-com, right? And you've got lots and lots of platforms in e-commerce that organizations want to sell into, and the biggest challenge then as an organization in that space is like, how do you aggregate and collect that information in a consolidated, consistent fashion so that you can report on it, understand it, monitor it, all of those kind of things, and then eventually get it into your finance system. And we see the same. We see the same in the charitable sector, particularly around fundraising. Lots of platforms popping up here, there, and everywhere, which will do various things. And so, the more that these platforms can plug into, the better. And typically, again, what you tend to see in the wider charity sort of CRM sector is that they'll plug into the key ones like Just Giving or Virgin Money, but then they won't plug into some of these other smaller third-party products as well. And the reality is that most charities are trying to expand their fundraising footprint as widely as possible, in terms of, they want to get out to as big an audience as possible to get money in. And even if it means that you just get one donation of £10 through Facebook, for example, then that's worth it. So really important. I think the other thing just to mention, and touching more on the payment side, but a lot of these platforms do have pricing that's specifically for charities as well. It's always worth mentioning that. So if you go to Go Cardless, you go to Stripe, you don't have to pay as a charity the standard pricing that you see on the websites. There are discounts available, and I think sometimes people miss that as an opportunity just to save a little bit more money. And again, charities have to maximize the benefit of the funds that they have, and invest those wisely as well. So always worth just reminding organizations of that fact.
Yeah, definitely. If you don't ask, you don't get. So make sure you ask when you're having those initial conversations and signing up. So look, we've covered kind of quite a breadth of Beacon, what it can do, how it can integrate, the size of organisation you probably need to be. But there's the change whenever you look to bring in a system is how do you handle the change management? Where do you start? Do you go all in? Do you start with a small element and build up? From your experience of working with charities and maybe even transitioning to Beacon, have you got any kind of key thoughts, things to be aware of, things to look out for if you're considering implementing Beacon or a similar system?
Yeah, so I mean, our experience has been that for the vast majority of charities that we've moved, they've been moving from a manual system or from Excel records and things like that. So really, what it's been a matter of is sort of chipping away at various things. So they may well have had sort of fundraising available through the website already because they've kind of manufactured something on the website to be able to collect donations. But then I don't know, their main fundraising marketing might have been done through another platform or done manually. And so really what it's a matter of is sort of chipping away at, what is your, highest priority in terms of pain point. So is it marketing to donors? Is it volunteer management like we talked about? Is it actually taking donations from various people and managing that through platforms? So it's really a matter of just chipping away at those. And then quite often what we find is as organizations get familiar with Beacon and they start to see more and more of the functionality, they tend to sort of come back. So I think in our experience, they tend to sort of switch on 2 or 3 elements of the platform in terms of what it can do. And then once they're sort of 3 to 6 months into the product and getting familiar with it and seeing what else it can do, they sort of come back and say, oh, can we now do X and move into doing that? Or actually, this was a lower priority for us at the beginning, but we'd like to help to automate or make this process a little bit more easier. So that typically is our experience. Definitely, I would say, the features that tend to get used the most from our point of view is the sort of donor and fundraising side of things, and then the volunteer management. Those are probably the two or three main areas that we see. Obviously, it can get quite complex with the ticketing and memberships, etc. But it tends to be the actual, I guess, the donations management bit of that side, which is the key bit that we see. And just to quickly add to that, I mean, what we saw from the survey that the fundraising magazine did is that that only 13% of charities look at their CRM and the systems on an annual basis, and then another 8% only do it on every 2 years. And then the numbers just get bigger and bigger. Some 14% of charities never look at their CRM and think about changing. 27% only look at it every 5 years. And I guess we've talked about this on other sessions of this, where we sort of said, with the way that the market moves and the technology changes that we're experiencing, is like, the minimum really that you should be looking at software should be probably every 2 or 3 years, just to make sure that what you're currently using is keeping up with the market, and also just to make sure that you're not missing out on something new that's come into the market that maybe you're not aware of. And yeah, 36% of charities said that changing CRM was either somewhat disruptive or hugely disruptive, but 43% said it was quite smooth. So there's good signs out there that actually changing CRM, which can be quite problematic for businesses and other organizations, seemingly it's a little bit easier to implement CRM in charities. And I suspect that's probably because a lot of charities tend to move from manual systems to something a bit more digital, a bit more automated, and so the outcome of that is always generally better.
Yeah, and it also depends on, are they trying to do everything themselves? Have they reached out to an expert? A big thing I find on charities is trying to justify the outlay, especially if you're doing things manually. Because like, well, we're adding a cost here, but really you're enabling yourself to be more streamlined. You don't need the same level of overheads from a staffing perspective. And if you're ever unsure, then there are experts out there that can do a return on investment calculation by mapping out your processes as they are, mapping out your processes to be in the new system. And it's something that we've been doing a long time at SB Digital, and it helps justify. It helps go to the board and go, look, we can save, we can make ourselves much more modern, much more flexible, probably attract a broader range of volunteers, and enable ourselves to broaden our fundraising landscape. So there's many opportunities, but a key one is that you can actually save money.
Yeah.
Now, the bit I was going to finish on is that, look, we've talked about Beacon. Beacon is one part of a charity's overall app stack. There's other things that you should always focus on as a charity. One is approvals from the whole kind of expense management, purchase order inside. We've talked about the likes of Dex and Approval Max before. There are other systems out there, but do check out our sessions on those. You've got integrated payments now. So, you've got the ability to lock down, because the biggest risk of fraud, especially in the not-for-profit sector, is people mishandling payments and redirecting funds themselves. And then integrated payroll and potentially HR. And if you do need it, if you are a not-for-profit that is maybe close to the wire from an operational perspective and financial perspective, then a good short-term cash flow forecasting tool such as Float would come in handy. We've looked at all these for clients before. Each, I guess, collection of apps should be unique to your organization based on your needs. Please do speak to an expert and make sure that what you're doing, what you're bringing in, is the right structure. And I think on that, John, that sounds like a great time to wrap up. Do you agree?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So hopefully anyone that's listening has, I guess, gained some valuable insights in either Beacon or the not-for-profit sector, or just how to approach digital transformation. Please do check out the show notes, links to the systems that we've referenced. Plus, if you do want to ensure you catch future episodes, even if it's on a not-for-profit series or not, please do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Make sure you look out for the live show every Thursday morning. John and I look forward to hopefully seeing you again next week.
Cheers.
Nice one, mate.